Okay, in this section, this is going to be one of the first shooting sessions. I'm going to shoot a single shot with the wide angle lens using bounce lighting. It's one of the simplest scenarios we can possibly get into. Before I get started, I wanted to show you a little bit about the power setup. When you plug your system in, this is the plug strip you'll have, one of them. You're going to want to plug your camera into here. You're going to want to plug the StackShot controller into this, and you're also going to want to plug the power for the remote into this. Now what you do at the end of the day when you're all done shooting, you don't have to turn off the power to this and turn off the power to the camera and turn off and unplug the StackShot. You just simply turn off your plug strip. Mine is under the floor right now, so for ease of demo I'm showing you this one. So when I come in the morning, I turn on my power strip, I start my computer, and everything's powered up when I go to work. I don't have to go around and touching individual things. You will have to come by and actually turn the power on to the remote because that doesn't auto start. That's it. Now the first thing you got to do is determine what you're going to photograph. That's going to determine your background and what kind of lighting you're going to use and what kind of lens you're going to use. So for demonstration purposes, we're going to photograph this rather large, tall branch, and I'll show you how we're going to do it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a background on this. So I'm going to take some of my gray paper, and I'll lay it down here. I'll move my lights out of the way, briefly, something like that. Typically, I want to put my lens on before I put my specimen below the camera. And the reason for this is, get used to this, handling type specimens. If you fumble and drop a lens, you can always replace the lens, but you can never replace a type specimen. So I like to get my camera and everything set up before anything's down there. This camera is already on, it's powered on, the cover is on the front of the camera. You try and put the lenses on with the camera off. Canon recommends this because while the camera is powered on, the chip is electrostatically charged and could attract dust from the room. So it's always good to make sure your camera is powered off when you put the lens on. Now, over here in your lens box, you'll have the sheet that comes with it that's already in your manual as well. That gives you an idea based on subject size what lens to use. And here down at the bottom it says material larger than 250 millimeters or 25 centimeters. You'd use the 35 millimeter lens, and it says f5.6 is a good starting point. So I know that I can go f4, f5.6, f8, and I'm in the ballpark. So based on that, knowing what my subject size is, it's time to put the lens on the camera. So I'm going to grab my lens, bring it over. I'll close my case because Now, notice the lens cap on the front. I always keep that on until the last minute. That way I can handle the lens, I can support the lens, and I don't have to worry about fingerprints. So I'm going to take off the rear lens cap and note the red dot on this lens. Can you see that red dot from there? Okay, that faces you, and it also lines up with another dot on the camera body. So you connect those dots and turn the lens and it locks into place. So I'm going to remove the body cap on the camera. I'm actually going to tighten my lift because I saw my camera go up. I'm going to remove the rear lens cap. I'm going to line them up, red dot facing me. I'm going to put it on, and I'm going to twist this to the right, and you'll hear a click. Did you hear the audio? Okay. Now I know my lens is secured to the camera. I can remove my lens cover like that. I typically keep my lens caps together somewhere back out of the seam. Again, you've got your magnetically mounted levels. You can always use these to check level on your camera and your base plate in either direction if you need at any given point in time. I've squared this up and I know that I'm straight on, so we're good. Now it's time to place the specimen down here. So I'm going to set my specimen. Let's see, it doesn't matter which way I go with it. I'll set my specimen here. Now I'm leaving I'm leaving some of the base plate uncovered here because I want to be able to actually see those hash lines in my image to know that my baseline is my base plate is in focus. Because we're going to do bounce light is going to be directed right at the ceilings. So again, I'm going to grab my lights here while I have it in a convenient position. Let me turn them on one at a time. Now if you'll notice, this U-joint in the back of the flash head has a slot in it that will allow you to tip the light all the way back. If you have this rotated to where that slot doesn't line up with the pivot ball, it will block how far the light can move in that direction. You would have to turn the light to line up with the slot and spin it around. So what I try and do is I know if I'm going to light up for the ceiling, I'm just going to rotate that around to where I have a convenient way to rotate it. Now I'm going to point it directly at the ceiling, and I'm going to lock my knob in place. And I'm always kind of careful to ease up and make sure that the arm is tight enough to support the flash head before I just let it go. Now I'm going to go do the same thing to the other one. Actually, I'm going to line this up a little bit straighter now that I'm there. You probably got a better beat on that than I do. So I'm going to go to this one and do the same thing. I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to line it up. And these don't have to be exactly straight up and down. The light is so big. And the ceiling is relatively short in the fact that it's about 9 feet. Can you pan up to the ceiling to get an idea of the distance? So that's what I'm shooting at. That's going to be my bounce card up on top. So I've got my remote on. I can turn on my modeling lamps and get a pretty good idea of what I've got. Now, in this case, when I'm describing this to you, I am going to split this up into two parts. I'm showing you the hardware setup first, and then I'm going to record on the screen so that we'll be able to have a really crisp idea of the actual image. I can zoom in and zoom out. When I'm referring to manually focusing this, I'm going to be actually getting up and moving the knob on the copy stand to move the camera up and down. Now one thing, I'm not going to be using the electric rail in this because we're not going to be doing stacking. Now there's a couple of things. One, I need to establish the magnification on my lens because I might want to have an accurate scale. So if I go to one of the whole measurements on this lens, it starts at 0.3, 0.4, 0.7, and I know from using this lens that 0.7 meters distance is about right for the mag that I want on this. So I'm going to start with 0.7 and then I'm going to move the camera up and down to gain my focus. I'm never going to touch the lens again. So when I'm referring to manual focus, I'm referring to proximity focusing, not twisting the lens. So I've got the lens set to 0.07. The little line lines up with the number 0.07 in there. That's it. I will turn the camera back on. That's an important step I often forget. Then I'm going to go into Capture One, and I can launch it with the keyboard function, and that is hitting MX2. So now Capture One is up. Now and I'll go through this in detail on the screen. But to get live view on my screen, I click the live view button. I'm going to turn on my modeling lamps so that I have some sort of a indication of where I'm shooting. And now in my live view, it kind of gives me an orientation as to where my subject is. So I can move this around and center it up into my field of view. And that's kind of where I want to start. Now, the trick is here, how do we focus on something that is this deep? Well, if I look at this and I measure it with a gauge, with a ruler, I'm about 15 centimeters from the bottom to the top. That's how much I have to cover in depth of field in one shot. I'm probably going to want to shoot f8 instead of f5.6, but 15 centimeters. Now, in your setup files under manuals, I've included a manual called Advanced Digital Imaging. It's a PowerPoint presentation I did a couple of years ago. And in it, I detail this concept, but I'm going to briefly touch this. When you focus on a point on your subject, what is in focus is about 2/3 below that point, but 1/3 above that point. But you can't see above that point if you're focusing on the top of your specimen because it's going to be dead airspace. You have no way to know what's in focus in that space. But this is physics and this is the way lenses work. So in the macro world, at this focal length, you're looking about 1/3 to 2/3. This can change to about 50% top and bottom depending on the focal length of your lens, but that's detailed in your manual. So this brings us to where do we focus when we're looking through the camera on our specimen? Well, if we round this off and say about 15 millimeters or 15 centimeters high, and we say that our focal point, our depth of field rather, is 1/3 above our focal point and 2/3 below our focal point. If we then focus at about 10 centimeters, we'll have 10 centimeters below and 5 centimeters above. That should be just about perfect. So I'm going to look for a 10 centimeter spot. And I'm going to go back here, and what I found is that right here, along this little branch sticking up, right past this little elbow, I'm marking it, that's about my 10 centimeter spot. Did I show that well? Could you see that in the camera? It's right about in here. So I want to make sure that my focus is right here. Now what happens is on all these digital lenses, they start out wide open. So this is at f2. You have virtually no depth of field. And the reason for that is that you know precisely where you're focusing. Once you stop your lens down to f5.6 or f8, you have lots of depth of field. So if you focus with your lens stopped down, it would be virtually impossible to tell where your focal point is. That's why the lenses start with wide open, f2 on this lens. So the next thing we'll do is I'll get into the screen imaging and I will show you, I'll zoom in, I will show you depth of field preview, and we will take some sample shots and I'll narrate from the screen. It's going to be a much tighter image. Before I step up to the monitor and start narrating through that, I wanted to point out what lighting we're using. I have selected TTL, which is fully automatic on this, and I have increased it by 0.03 f-stop by hitting my plus sign. I want a little bit of a brighter background than what the camera would normally deliver at TTL. But it is going to be metering and determining its own exposure. I won't have any control over the exposure. This will be automatic just to give you an idea of what it does. So over here on the monitor, I'm ready to take my first shot to see if I'm within spec of where I need to be. So we can, just to get a quick shot before I jump into this, once the image pops onto the screen, a histogram will show up on top showing me where my exposure is. Again, I'll get into all this in Capture One. But I'm going to take a shot now just to see what it does. I've got my, by the way, I've got my camera set at f8 because I do have an extreme depth of field, and I know f5.6 is going to be pushing it. But we'll do that later too. We'll look at that. I'll take a shot. There's my image, nice and evenly lit around the background. I've got the exposure I want. Here's my histogram. It's showing me I'm just slightly on the lighter side of dead center, which is exactly where I want to be. So I'll take it. At this point, we're going to get into the monitor, and I'll show you how we can change that a little bit by hitting plus or minus so you can see what the differences are. I will show you the depth of field preview and what it looks like at f5.6 relative to f8 and how you can make that shot. So that's it. We'll go into the monitor now. Okay, here we are at the monitor to run through a single shot of the 35 millimeter of that little tree branch that we detailed out beforehand. So first thing I'm going to do is start capture one. I'm going to run it from the taskbar just to keep things simple. I can use the keyboard key, which would be MX2 if we wanted to launch it that way. First thing we do is go over to the camera tab, and I've got my modeling lights on. I'm going to be describing the hardware situation while I'm describing the monitor. I'm going to put on my live view. I've got my modeling lights on. We've got it set up to where we're showing some of the hash marks on the table so that you can see where we're focused. You can see here that the pine needles up on top are way out of focus. Our point of interest that we measured was down here, right here on this branch. So we have the lens at 0.7 meters. That's the magnification we're using. So that covers our field of view just nicely. To focus this lens, we're not going to touch the lens again. We're going to be moving the lens actually up to meet this point. I'm going to go over to the camera, to the copy stand right now, and I'm going to raise it up until this becomes in focus. Okay, raising it up now. Raising it up. There we go. Actually, it's a little on the high side. I'm going to go down about there. I want this in focus right here, which I've got. All right. I've got F8 selected because I know I'm going to need quite a bit of depth of field with this. Now, it's kind of cool. This is called the depth of field preview. And what's nice about this is I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, this stuff's out of focus because I'm looking at previewing this at f2.0, which is the lens wide open. But if I were to shoot this at f8, what would it look like? Well, there's a depth of field preview button in your live view window. And if you press it, it shows you what will be in focus when you shoot. So it takes all the guesswork out of it, which is a really nice thing. Now that's a kind of a grainy video preview, but it works. So now we know we're focused on the right spot, and we're going to be shooting this in TTL. Now the TTL lighting on this is biased to 0.6, meaning that I'm asking it to go a little bit brighter than what it normally considers a proper exposure. And the reason I'm doing that is because I don't care about how accurate, I don't care about a perfect exposure on my gray background. I'm more interested in my green and my dark pine cone being exposed well enough. So I'm asking it to give it a little bit more light. So I'm going to take a test shot. There's my first shot. Notice where my peak is. It's right up over this 1. Now, a normal TTL would send my peak up closer to 0. And I can demonstrate this by actually I'm going to go into my remote, and I'm going to take my TTL bias, and by hitting the minus sign, I'm going to take all the bias off of it and turn it to 0. So now TTL should be closer to factory. You heard the double tap on it. Okay, you see how the 0 is lining up with the peak of my exposure? You see how much darker it is? I prefer the lighter because I want this and some of the bright greens to show up. I don't care about the background. This is telling me, hey, this is the proper exposure for your gray background. I don't care. So I'm going to put it back up on 0.6. So I'm going to hit the plus button. And I've clicked it 5 times to bring it up to 0.6. Now I'll take another shot. So there we are again. So that's where we want to be. So now we're at F8. Let's look at the bottom. So I'm going to grab my hand up here, the pan hand, and I'm going to click on the bottom. And this is not only in focus, but it is razor sharp focus. I can see the edge of this line here. I can see the texture, the spectral highlights on the texture of the paint. And every needle is absolutely crystal clear on this. So I've got 15 centimeters of depth in one shot with F8. Now I've got a lot of other stuff in this image that, like the table and the easel, that I'm going to have to crop out in Photoshop. But notice that there are no shadows on this. Now I'll get into some lighting effects in a little bit when we're shooting. I'll show you how you can, because of the bounce light, there are no shadows. But if I had direct illumination on this, as you know, you put a light on one side, it makes a shadow. It makes highlights and shadows. So the bounce light gives you a very, very soft, shadow-free light. So that's it. So the next thing I want to do, now that I've got my image, and I know that, let's double check. Let's make sure F5 wouldn't give us a shot. So I'm going to go into, put it to F5.6, a lower f-stop, and I am going to shoot TTL with a bias. It's going to give me a correct exposure. Okay, let's take a look at this. Double click it. Well, it's pretty close. I'm seeing a little softness up here on top. A little soft over here. That's a little soft. I bet you the bottom's good. I can see the texture on the paper. Yeah, the bottom's okay. It's not as sharp as the previous one. So F8 is giving us a better, sharper image. Yeah. I'm liking the F8. So you can look in here and see there's F8, and now I'm going to drop it to F5.6. F5.6 is in fact a little bit softer. So F8 would be my ticket. It'd be right here. I want to export this out. So I'm going to go over here. I can hit the export key on the keyboard, which brings me to the output. I'm going to put it in a subfolder. We'll make a new subfolder and we'll call it simply Pine. And we're going to name our image and we'll call it Branch. And we've noted that it is a 35 millimeter and lens and what the magnification is. This is important because this, as we've talked about in Lightroom, this is what determines our magnification scale in Photoshop. Now I'm going to process this. It's going into the subfolder that we've created and we're done. That's it. Now we can bring it in Photoshop and take a look at it. I'm going to reduce this down just to verify in fact we've got it. I'm going to go up to, okay, we said Pine. There we go. I'm going to open this up. And there we are, single shot. Now I'm going to go ahead and crop this thing out a little bit. I use my select tool and I'm going to crop it. Now this is without any sharpening. I'll hit Control-Alt-0. This will bring me to 100%. I can drag this around. Okay, so this is without any sharpening, and it is absolutely tack sharp. So, yeah, that works. This is a real easy way to get a single pop using bounce light on a relatively large subject. Now, if I wanted to, lastly, put a measurement scale in here, the importance of having the file name and lens we're using, I'm going to hit my F7 key, which opens up my measurement scales. I go down here and I find the lens, 35 millimeter, and I find the magnification, 0.7. I click on it, and now it's calibrated. Now I hit my M7 key, and it asks me what size scale I'd like. It says right now it's 10 centimeters. I'm going to say, make it 5. And I'm going to say on my font size, I want something around, I don't know, 18 point. I want my line and my color of my text and my line to be black. And I want my font to be below my line. And I hit OK. And there we have it. Now I've got an accurate scale bar that I can move and position anywhere on my image. And this is accurate within a pixel. because we've taken shots with this lens and blown them up to 1,000% and been able to determine how many pixels there are per millimeter. So this is an extremely accurate measuring tool. In the tutorial for Photoshop, it gets into how to use this tool, how to export these measurements to an Excel spreadsheet, as you know, but this is basically it. So I'm going to close this out. I'm not going to bother saving changes with it. I'm going to close out Photoshop. I'm going to go back into Capture One and clean it out. So now I'm going to simply hit delete all. I'm going to click on it first and hit delete all. And that gets rid of everything that I've got in there, and I'm done. I'll close it out, and we're finished.